Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the June Conditions and Outlooks briefing. And yeah, it's already June somehow. I'm Tony Bergantino, Director of the Wyoming State Climate Office and the Water Resources Data System. And we'll be presenting this webinar in addition to folks from the USDA Northern Plains Climate Hub and University of Wyoming Extension, the U.S. Geological Survey, the Bureau of Reclamation, Bureau of Land Management, National Weather Service over in Cheyenne, and the National Weather Service Missouri Basin River Forecast Center. So this briefing will cover drought, lack of drought in places, climate conditions, surface water status, reservoir storage. We'll take a look forward at weather forecasts and outlooks. And our featured topic this month will be a summary of the runoff and flood season. So we'll start things off with the current conditions as usual and jump to the drought monitor map. And this is hot off the presses from this morning. It goes through Tuesday, which is the 12th. Recent precipitation has really continued to erode away the drought levels in many areas, especially the east and southeast, but also some areas over in the Green River Basin. And as you'll see later on, the Northwest has not received as much precipitation and conditions there. They've deteriorated a bit over the last webinar. The green areas on the map show areas that have improved since our last webinar when we talked to you last, while the areas outlined in red up there in the northwest corner there are the ones that have deteriorated. You also see some black outlines down in the southeast and up in the northwest that haven't been on earlier maps. And I put those on there to indicate areas that saw either a 2 or more category improvement or degradation since the last webinar. The ones down there in the southeast were improvements, whereas that bit up there in the park area there, that center black area, is an area that went down 2 levels, went from the D0 to D2. So we'll look at the timelines. Here we have the updated timeline showing the percentage that each area of drought covers in Wyoming, the percent of land area since the start of 2000 through this Tuesday. The area of state in actual drought conditions, those D1 to D4 categories, decreased by just over 2.5% since the last webinar, leaving just under 16% of Wyoming in the D1 to D4 category. No D3 or D4 present, but so that's basically the D1 and D2. When you count D0, again, that's not drought, that's just an abnormally dry category. Just over 39% of the state is affected. The timeline here, make this available each week at the link at the lower left, and it was also on that list of links that Wendy sent out to participants. And these charts are also at the county level as well. We'll zoom in, or we'll try to zoom in to the 2020 to present, just to get an expanded view here and see things in a little bit more detail. That white area over there on the right is just continuing to expand as everything sort of drops off and we clear some of the drought categories off the map in places. About 61% of Wyoming now has no D category whatsoever. That's that white space. And just under 85% is in D0 or abnormally dry or better. And that's the yellow and the white space above it. Looking at 14-day total precipitation statewide, again, and as always, in terms of a percentile, this is over the last 2 weeks, very wet. The gray-white areas received about median precipitation up there somewhere in the northwest and bits over there in the northeast. And the rest, that green to purple, shows the rest of the state receiving above to well above the median, especially north central Wyoming, although there's some bright purple indicating greater than 98th percentile down in central Albany County as well. 2 areas of somewhat concern are the far western Teton County, very, very minor blips over there, and then a small area in northeastern Niobrara County and going into southeastern Weston County. Same map, but at the 90-day time frame, the 3-month window, you can see the northwest again being concerning, with most of the Teton and Western Park County being in the 20th percentile or less. A little bit in the western flanks, the Bighorns that are also running below median, along with the Medbos and Sierra Madres down in southern Carbon County. A few other isolated patches around the rest of the state, but by and large, The rest of the Wyoming was at or above median precipitation over the last 3 months. Looking at the standardized precipitation index, that SPI. Again, these maps show the indices for the 30 and 60-day time frames. They're on the top left and right respectively, and 1 year at the bottom on the lower right. And just again, recall that these maps are an index value, not actual precipitation amounts. So still some areas of concern. You can see the Northwest has improved some compared to the situation at the 60 days. South central parts have also improved a lot on the wet side conditions at the 30-day, but those areas were kind of dry when you looked at it last month, and so there's been improvement. I didn't circle the blue spots, as you can see the widespread wet signal on these maps, so didn't want to clutter everything up too much. At 60 days, they're on the upper right. The Northwest tends to stand out a little bit as dry. Still an area in the Bighorn Basin showing up last month that has now disappeared, even though a small blob on the dry side in the center of Bighorn County there. Like I say, a lot of improvements, a lot down in south central Wyoming. Dry indices that covered most of Carbon County during last month's webinar have contracted quite a bit. On the bottom right is the depiction for the last year. Central part of the state, Sheridan County, Uinta, showing some stronger wet signal. Not a lot of dry to the index at the 1 year. Some over in southern Weston, northern Niobrara, as well as Teton County, and a few scattered other areas, but those are just barely over on the dry side compared to especially what we were seeing earlier on in the drought. Going to, this is the 14-day average minimum temperature. So average min temperatures over the last 2 weeks. On the upper right here are the actual temperatures, and the average min temps over the last 2 weeks have been above freezing everywhere except for the very, very high elevations. Bighorn Basin and the Northeast have been 50s to upper 50s for lows, also along with an area down in Goshen and Platte counties. High valleys have been lows, seen lows in the upper 30s, while the rest of the state about in the 40s. Looking down here on the left in terms of departure from average, mostly above normal statewide, except for a few small splotches in Sweetwater, Carbon County that were about up to 3 degrees below average. Southern tier of the state generally 3 degrees above average with those exceptions. While in the Bighorn, Powder Tongue basins, we see departures of 6 to 9 degrees above average. The remainder of the state, mostly in that 3 to 6 degree range. And switching over to maximum temperature over the last 2 weeks, upper right again is the actual temperatures here. Bighorn Basin and Northeast were the warmest with highs in the upper 70s, averaged over the last 2 weeks. Surrounding areas were in the mid 70s. And then for the remainder of the state, except for the higher elevations, max temperatures were in the 60s. In terms of departure from average, again, down here in the lower left, far northeast, northwest, about 3 to 6 degrees above average, with a larger surrounding areas being up to 3 degrees above average. Going south, the departure turns negative, so below average temperatures. And the farther south, the more the departure was, such that the southern tier again, except some of Uinta and parts of Sweetwater County, were 3 to 6 degrees below average, with the northern part of that being about 3 degrees below. The far southeast, and over the last 2 weeks, did see maximum temperatures as much as 9 degrees below average. And we'll then switch over to soil moisture. Really improved a lot, or if it hasn't improved, remained mostly the same for a large chunk of the state, with the exception of some degradation up in the far reaches of the Northwest in Yellowstone Park along the border with Montana. Good gains in the north central areas, as well as some large areas of central and eastern Wyoming. So quite a bit of change in soil compared to where we were at our last webinar. And thanks to a lot of this recent precipitation over the last 30 days or so. And so now with that, I will turn it over to Aaron Fiaschetti with the USGS, who will now give us an update on streamflow and surface water conditions. Aaron?
Thanks, Tony. Appreciate the introduction. So here we are, middle of June, and pretty pleased to say that across the board that we have good stream flow conditions around all corners of the state. We do have these are percentiles of flow. The green is your normal. That's the 25th to 75th. So that just saying it's normal to be low at the 25th and it's normal to be high at the 75th. But in general, if you surf around all these gauges showing green, most are above the median. So pretty good flow for this time of year. We do have there is one site that's showing much below normal. That's the Snake River near Moose. That's probably a result of maybe some storage upstream in Jackson Lake. And then there is one site, the Henry's Fork near Manila, that's in minor flood, according to our National Water Information Dashboard right now. So across the board, things are normal or above normal. That's the light blue, that's above the 75th percentile. And then much above normal is the dark blue lines or dark blue circles. So moving on, Tony. So here we are. This is a duration hydrograph for an amalgamation of various gauges through the state, and it's showing a 7-day average runoff in millimeters. So it's kind of a runoff per square area. But the point of this is to show that we're basically at the peak of the hydrograph for the year. It's a time of abundant water supply around Wyoming. Probably in general, if your water's coming from snowmelt in the mountains, this is kind of what that hydrograph represents. I know there's many streams where the snowmelt comes from the prairie or foothills that have a different hydrograph, but so we're kind of at the peak or a little bit past the peak, depending on how much rain we get. Most of the snow is pretty well depleted, so we're just kind of wait for continued rain to see if that pushes things up into maybe a continued good water supply or flooding, depending on how much water comes. But right now it's the time to fill reservoirs, time to get a lot of ground irrigated, and for flows to move things around in the river. So abundant water supply. So here we are. I'll just kind of bounce around to a couple corners of the state. The North Fork of the Shoshone. The hydrograph here, the black line, is the flow for 2023. So this is a stream where the water supply comes out of the mountains, mostly snowmelt with precipitation, but things look pretty good. Probably a little bit early on that peak for the year. We're coming out at the end of May, middle to the end of May, but flows have been pretty well sustained there. And we'll see what happens with rain, if that'll start to get on the falling limb of the hydrograph or it'll maintain for another week or so. But things look pretty good on the Shoshone right now. You can see there in January, February, and March, we were in that very low flow near the 5th percentile or below when we're at winter base flows. So it's nice to see us near the other end of the spectrum where we're above normal, and that'll help with conditions there on the Shoshone. Next, here's the Belle Fourche. So this is an example of a stream that doesn't get its water supply from high mountains and snowpack, where you see there's a lot more variability in what is normal, nearly 0 to 10 CFS throughout the winter months. But in this is a stream where that prairie snowmelt or plain snowmelt comes out in March, and that kind of typically gives it the peak for the year. And then right around now, that spring precip is kind of bumping flows up again. But things look pretty good. We're closer to the 75th percentile there on the Belle Fourche, and it looks like to be a good water supply year there right now. Moving on to the North Platte above Seminole, things kind of chugged along above the median for most of the winter there, and kind of dipped a little bit low in March, but kind of had a little bit of an early peak here in April, and then again in May, that snow a little bit ahead of schedule for that runoff, where the flows were not extra high there, but since it was a little bit earlier, we're getting up into that 95th percentile or so, and looks like we're starting to decline there on the North Platte, but things seem to be pretty good there. The water supply looks pretty reasonable right now. And then moving over to the next slide, please. The one low flow site here is the Snake River at Moose. I know Jackson Lake was quite low over the winter. So from October to essentially May, we're in that 10 to 24th or below the 5th in a few instances. But right now, that little bit of runoff moving through the system, but things seem to be below the median, and now we're dipping back into that 5th percentile of flow. And I expect that's probably from management of the reservoir above, because the other sites on the Snake downstream where tributaries come in look pretty good. But that was an area that was pretty dry last year. So moving on to reservoirs here from this teacup diagram, pretty significant increases, and from May 25th till now, that's expected with runoff. Most reservoirs increased by 10 to 25%. And if you look around, there is still that the blue line shows how full it is. There's still some white here and there. So most reservoirs are close to 75% full, but there's still a ways to go to fill up some of them that have been depleted from the dry periods we've had in the last year or more. So some good increases, but not everything is brimming right now. And I'm sure Liz will fill us in more on that as we go forward. That's all I have. Thank you.
Thanks, Aaron. And Aaron mentioned fill-in reservoirs. It's a good way to have now George Finnegan with the Bureau of Reclamation to talk about reservoir ops.
Yeah, I'm filling in for Liz today. Thank you, everybody. As of June 14th, the Bighorn system is 93% full, which is 115% above average. Our Bull Lake content is 135,000 acre feet with capacity of 152,000. So we're 89% full and 118% above average. Buffalo Bill has 599,000 acre feet with a capacity of 646,000 and is 92% full with 115% of average. And Boyson is 698,000 acre feet full with 741,000 capacity. So it's 94% full and 114% of average. You can see we don't have a lot of storage space left in the Wind River Bighorn. I've got some notes here. In coordination with operations at Bighorn Lake and the United States Army Corps of Engineers, we're reducing outflows from Boyson Reservoir to mitigate potential flooding within the Bighorn River Basin. Bighorn Lake is currently operating within the exclusive flood control pool. With the reduced outflows at Boyson, we anticipate Boyson Reservoir will enter the exclusive flood control pool within the next few days. The release from Boyson will decrease by approximately 1,000 cubic feet per second. So flows will decrease from 4,500 to 3,500. We should be in the flood pool on Sunday, and we anticipate we'll go into the flood pool 20,000 acre feet with a flood pool space of 150,000 acre feet. Okay. Go ahead and go to the North Platte. Yeah, let's see. Yeah, so Seminole, 506,000 acre. Now this looks like looks like we got these mixed up here, and that's okay. I'm going to go ahead and read off of my chart here. Seminole has 832,000 acre feet in storage as of yesterday. And that is 82% full, which is 117% of average. Pathfinder had 603,000 acre feet yesterday. That's only 56% full and 92% of average. Glendo had 485,000 acre feet yesterday, which is 99% full and 98% of average. Let's see, and I'll go back to the presentation. You know, I didn't mention Guernsey. Guernsey has, let's see, Guernsey's a little reservoir we use to make our irrigation deliveries. 28,000 acre feet and is 61% full, 88% of average. That looks like it's about pretty close anyway. And so we're really watching Glendo right now. Our irrigation demands have been pushed back twice already. And so we're seeing what we can do to keep from going into the flood pool there. Yeah, and that's all I have, unless anybody has any questions on our North Platte River operation. And just to update this, because this isn't correct either, we've got 28,000 CFS coming out of Seminole Cordis. We've got 1,200 CFS coming out of Gray Reef. And we've got about 1,000 CFS coming out of Glendo, Guernsey.
Thanks, George. Now, looking forward, we'll go to Tony Anderson, who's with the National Weather Service over in Cheyenne, and we'll be looking at the forecasts and outlooks. Tony?
All righty. Thank you, Tony. Good afternoon, everyone. If you jump ahead to the next slide there. All right. Looking at the precipitation for the next 7 days. The wet period continues, especially through the weekend. We'll be looking at scattered afternoon and evening showers and thunderstorms through Saturday, and some locations may miss out because these are going to be convective in nature. We're not going to get the big stratiform systems that cover the whole state, but we should be seeing pretty frequent and regular showers and thunderstorms through Saturday. The frequency of those storms is going to diminish through Monday and Tuesday, and it may actually pick up next week. So right now we're forecasting that the wettest area looks to be the Wind River Basin above and near Boysen Reservoir, kind of between the Wind River Mountains and the Owl Creek Mountains up there by Boysen. Go ahead, next slide. And I apologize, I just realized I was supposed to fill in some of the details on that map and I completely spaced it out. So my apologies. So looking at the 6 to 10 day outlook. So we're going to step a little beyond that 7-day outlook that we looked at. And these are more probabilistic outlooks. On the left-hand side is temperature. And from day 6 through day 10 from now, we're looking at a below normal temperature signal that strengthens from weak to very strong as you move from east to west across the state. There's a very tight gradient in the outlook there. Moving over to the right-hand side, the precipitation outlook, not as strong a signal and certainly not as diverse a signal with that tight gradient. But the entire state is covered by a weak above normal signal, or excuse me, I mistyped there. A weak above normal signal for precipitation, and it's strengthening from weak to moderate in the east. So in the east, it's a moderate signal. In the western 3/4 of the state, it's a weak signal. Go ahead. Stepping out a little bit further in the outlook process, we're going to move from days 6 to 10 through days 8 through 14. And here the signals become a little less clear. on the temperature side, we have a weak signal for below normal temperatures across most of the state. And that weakens to the northeast to no signal at all. So basically in that northeast section, you'd be looking, your best forecast would be near normal conditions. Jumping over to the precipitation side, there's again a weak signal for above normal precipitation across most of the state, except in the southwest where it weakens to no signal at all. Once again, in that southwestern portion, your best forecast would be a near normal forecast. Next slide, please. Jumping out to a full month, the signals become even weaker. There on the left-hand side, the temperature, there is no clear signal from the global weather pattern. Near climatology is going to be your best forecast for temperatures, which is kind of a relief after 3 or 4 weeks of rain and cold. Jumping to the right, on the precipitation side, we're looking at a weak to moderate signal for above normal precipitation in the north. And that weakens as you move south back into that equal chances or no signal category, where your best forecast for that time period would be a climate forecast. Just go with what the long-term average says. Next slide, please. All right, that is all I have for you in terms of our outlooks, and we're going to pass it back to Tony. Thanks.
All right, thanks, Tony. And for this next slide and a few after that, we'll go to Casey Cheesebro with the Bureau of Land Management to look at wildland fire outlooks and conditions. Casey.
Good afternoon, everybody. So did kind of rebuild a slide that we used last year just to kind of speed through it, but a quick overview on some of the terms I'll be using as we talk about fire danger around the state right now. So obviously, the way fires burn, the intensity at which fires burn, the rates of spread is really driven on the fuel moisture, the fuels that can burn. So really, we talk about two types of fuels: live fuel moisture, which is influenced by the species characteristics and the seasonality, right? The green up timeline of different species, and then the available moisture in the soil and then in the air as well. And then we get into dead fuel moisture, so all the dead fuels that are out there, and we break that into 4 classes, which is based on what we call time lag. So really it's, to oversimplify it a little bit, the amount of time that it takes those fuels to kind of equilibrate with the humidity of that environment. And so we got 1 hour fuels, just your really small fuels, grasses, small twigs, 10-hour fuels, smaller branches, larger twigs, those types of things, 1/4 to 1 inch in diameter. And then your 100-hour fuels, maybe your larger branches, 1 to 3 inch size material. And then 1,000-hour fuels, which is 3 to 8 inches in diameter. So those are your larger fuels in forested areas that take, roughly a little more than a month or so to really respond to what the weather's doing. And so that's a good one, as we're looking at a monthly presentation. We'll kind of key in on that 1,000-hour fuel, just because it's usually valid to look out a little bit further on what things look like, and then really focus on this energy release component, or the ERCs, which is really, to simplify that as well, it's the amount of energy per square foot within a flaming front of a fire. And it's really just a composite of these dead and live fuel moistures that I just talked about. So those will be kind of the values we'll be looking at here in these next couple of slides. They did change some of the products that I was used to using last year. So some of the maps that I used to pull up aren't available currently. I think part of that's because of the slow fire season. Some of the coordination centers haven't updated some of their products that they usually put out in fire season, because it's although it's mid-June, doesn't really seem like fire season anywhere. So these numbers are really just predictive service areas. So you see RN01 is the Shoshone National Forest area. You can see it leaves out a big chunk of northwestern Wyoming there. That lands in a different geographic area as opposed to the Rocky Mountain area that's in the Great Basin area technically. And the data wasn't up to date for that. And I know that was one of those that one of the earlier presenters kind of highlighted as being a little below normal precipitation wise. But this chart here shows the energy release component in that area starting January 1st. So about what you would expect through the winter, very low, obviously. And then following a seasonal trend, we actually did get above average in mid to late May there for a little while in that northwestern part of the state. Again, that was one of the relatively speaking, drier parts of the state, but here the recent moisture that we've had, some of the even the cloud cover, and maybe not even high precipitation amounts, but just cooler days and cloud cover, we're seeing that dip well below average there. And what we're on this slide, I did want to point out a couple key lines. These two gray lines that you see towards the top of that graph are percentiles, the 90th percentile being the lower line there, and then the upper line being the 97th percentile. Those are really kind of key values that we key in on as far as ordering more resources, upping our preparedness for wildland fire when we get to that 90th and 97th percentile values, kind of what we would call critical levels. So obviously we're well below that, even in what we would consider one of the drier parts of the state right now. Next slide, Tony. So here's the 1,000 hour fuel moistures. So this would be kind of inverse of your energy release component. So these are, this blue line up here would be the current values this year, 2023. So a high fuel moisture value would be a lower energy release component, if that makes sense. These fuels have more moisture in them. And so they're those larger fuels up in the Shoshone National Forest part of the area. Again, well above average, definitely well above the maximum values that we've seen, or I guess in this case, the minimum values as we're talking fuel moisture. And then kind of have the inverse of those critical lines there, the 3rd and 10th percentiles there. So things still looking really good there. We can click to the next one. So just looking, kind of moving clockwise around the state from that northwestern part of the state, going over to the Bighorns here, you see fairly similar, not that's pretty much what we would expect. The Bighorns and the Shoshone would be fairly similar. So ERC values there on the left, well below average, well below those critical thresholds, and then the 1,000 hour fuel moistures there in the graph on the right-hand side, also tracking well above average. So, next one. One of our drier areas, you see a little more variability here in that ERC graph. This is the Devil's Tower area, so northeastern part of Wyoming, and you see a lot of that variability just because there's a lot more of those finer fuels, those smaller fuels up there, more of a grassland and mixed forest type in northeastern Wyoming. So you just see more variability as those conditions respond, and those fuels that dry more quickly or absorb moisture more quickly. But we're so a little bit drier in that part of the state, tracking right around average, still below those maximum values, and below that 90th, 97th percentile there in the ERCs. And that 1,000 hour fuel moistures on the right again, kind of just running the inverse of what we see in the energy release component. So above average and above critical values there. Looking down in the Medicine Bow area, what we call Area 15, and it's pretty similar to what we've seen around the state. Saw a pretty good climb there through May, and then here this these storms we've had, the cloud cover, cooler temperatures is really moderating things for now in the Medicine Bow, the Sierra Madre Snowy Range area in southern Wyoming. So not a lot of concern currently in that part of the world either. In this RM11, kind of the Great Divide Basin, southwestern Wyoming, you can see over there on the left, very much the same. Again, we crawled up to just about average, came in very low, a lot of moisture in that part of the world through the winter, obviously a lot of snow cover. We did see a pretty normal climb up to average values, and then this wetter, cooler period here in June, really moderating things there as well. So combine all of that with our seasonal green up. June, middle of June is usually green up anyway for our grasses, shrubs, all those types of things. So combine that with dead fuels that really aren't dry, and we're not seeing a lot of fire danger statewide at the moment. And that really jives with, so we can go to the next slide, Tony, real quick. So before we jump into this national kind of picture, just speaking back to Wyoming, I think that it really fits into what we're seeing nationwide. I mean, it's one of the slowest starts to fire season that I can remember. Been in this about 20 years. We're just not seeing, almost any measurable fire activity nationwide, even at this point. So resource availability is quite high right now. The one exception would be that the U.S. has been shipping some fire resources, overhead incident management teams, and fire resources aircraft and whatnot to Canada. Folks remember the smoke that came into Wyoming a few weeks ago, and that was kind of late May. And then what hit the news there and on the East Coast as well. So those fires are still very active, so very dry in Canada, and a lot of fire activity there. And that's really been the only draw so far on U.S. fire resources. Looking kind of nationwide, this comes out at the first of every month, and so it's a couple weeks past, when this version of this map came out. But that's pretty much what we're seeing. Starting to see a little bit of activity up in the Northwest, Oregon and Washington, and then in kind of northern U.S., Michigan, Minnesota, Wisconsin, those areas, seeing a little bit of drier conditions, and then Alaska starting to get some larger fires up in Alaska as well. Going into July, really not expecting much of a change, a little bit of an expansion down into kind of the northern Great Basin, Northern California there, with some of the higher fire danger in July, kind of a normal seasonal migration, if you will, down into those areas. And we go to the next one, Tony. Thanks. So I just kept that July map there. That's on the left, just to kind of see how it compares to August there on the right. And so really not looking at much of a change going into August even. That's kind of odd to not see a significant change as we get into those hotter, drier months. But some of what they were talking about with the Weather Service, not seeing a lot of potential, or at least right now, a lot of those strong signals for hotter, drier weather. So we'll just kind of see how that plays out. The one thing I would add, which I'm sure is on some people's minds, there's a lot of grass growing around Wyoming, more than usual in a lot of areas. And so if we do get a change in the weather late in the summer, when things are already kind of hitting that seasonal curing, and then we add some hot and dry weather in there, going into August, September, those timeframes, there may be that increase in large fire potential. Some of the normal grass fires may just be more resistant to control, harder to catch on initial attack, and it could be larger fires. Not to paint any alarm, that'll just be a picture that'll develop as time goes on here this summer. But pretty quiet start to the season, so we're all kind of enjoying some downtime. Appreciate it.
All right. Thanks, Casey. So now for this month's highlight, we have Kevin Lau, who is with the National Weather Service Missouri Basin River Forecast Center, and he's going to talk to us about a recap of the 2003 runoff and flood season with a little bit of an outlook at the end. Kevin?
All righty. Thank you, Tony. Can you hear me all right? Okay, great. Good afternoon, everyone. As Tony said, I'm Kevin Lau. I'm a engineer with the National Weather Service Missouri Basin River Forecast Center in Kansas City. And I'll be, as Aaron mentioned, since we are at our traditional time for the peak in the streams from mountain snowpack, first week of June is usually when I set my clock for the crest and the mountains. We thought it'd be a good time, the team did, to present a runoff summary for this year, since we should be at the peak or just past it. I'm going to use this map, courtesy of the NRCS, as my context. So I'll be talking about several of these basins, and that's sort of the spatial level that I'll be speaking about moving forward. And I will be talking about flooding, and I do want to acknowledge that I may not reference the flooding that you saw because of the limitations and the mission of the river forecast centers. Our modeling sort of puts us toward the bigger rivers. We have a better opportunity or a better accuracy and precision with the bigger river system. So when I say that this basin or that basin did not see flooding, I fully realize that you may have seen localized flooding in your area that I won't address. So without further ado, Tony, if you'd go to the first slide, I'll begin with the Yellowstone Basin within the state of Wyoming. And again, I'm going to be going through about a dozen of these slides, and every slide will have these three main components. In the upper left, I'll be using, again, the NRCS SWE, snow water equivalent progression maps. In the lower left, I'll be using the National Weather Service water supply forecast graphics. And then to the right, I'll be looking at when the seasonal river crested, when the river crested for this basin. And I sort of chose what I thought to be a representative river station for that right-hand graph there. So for the Yellowstone basin within Wyoming, the Mountain Swee peaked, the snow water equivalent peaked on 26th April at 109% of the 30-year median. So, basically we hit median a little better. And that then produced the lower left. The National Weather Service issues a water supply or water volume in terms of acre feet for the period April through September. So we're only about halfway through that forecast period, but snow drives the runoff. And so I think it's pertinent, or it's fairly accurate to say that we're thinking that for this basin, we're going to have about a 74% of median runoff for the April through September time period. So, and that's, if you want to, the NRCS also issues water supply forecasts for this same time period. And so you can, if you want to, you can compare our values with the NRCS. And to do that, I would actually use the volume number, the 1,480 kilo acre feet value, the 1,480,000 acre feet value, to compare, if you want to, with the NRCS's value. And then on the right, did we see flooding in the Yellowstone? Well, no, we did not. Not the Yellowstone in Wyoming anyway. We got to about 8.2 back on May 23rd, a stage of 8.2, and the flood stage there at Corwin Springs is 11. So we were a couple of feet below flood stage. So that's sort of the summary for the Yellowstone. With the next slide, I'll go to the Wind River Basin. Swee peaked along the wind at 111%. The runoff volume, the April through September runoff volume, we are expecting 132% of the 30-year median for the Wind River Basin. And the Wind River also did not see flooding this season. Flooding, and I picked Du Bois, Wind River at Du Bois as my checkpoint. Flood stage is 4.5 feet or 5 feet. And it did get back in May, it did get late May, it got to 4.5 feet. So it got within half a foot of getting to flood stage, but didn't quite make it. So no flooding along the wind, I am saying. Moving to the Bighorn Basin with the next slide. So the Bighorn snow peaked at 102% of the 30-year median. The runoff volume that the Weather Service is predicting for the Bighorn Basin in Wyoming is 113% of median, or 2,690,000 acre feet. Again, that's an April through September volume forecast. So a little bit better than median there. And again, we did not see flooding along the Bighorn River this season, at least not so far. And we're not expecting it either, even though earlier in today's discussion, they talked about the movement of water between the reservoirs. We did hit 8.7 a couple of days ago. Flood stage at, this is Bighorn at Basin, by the way. Flood stage at Basin is 10.5. So we got within 2 feet of flood stage a couple of days ago, but we're now on a downward trend. So again, no flooding along the Bighorn. With the next slide, we'll move to the Tongue. The Tongue snow peaked at 95% of the 30-year median, and we expect 106% of the 30-year runoff. So about a normal runoff season there for the Tongue. And we don't have a flood stage set for the Tongue, but the local weather forecast office does monitor the Tongue at Dayton. And that graph there is for Dayton. It got to 5 feet on June the 5th. So that was last Monday, it got to 5 feet. And action stage, that's when the National Weather Service becomes concerned, is 6. So it did remain below action stage there along the Tongue River. The next slide is the Powder. Snow in the Powder Basin peaked at 107% back on April 8th, 107% of the 30-year mean. And the National Weather Service water supply volume forecast is calling for 127% of the 30-year median. And we don't have, again, we don't have a flood monitoring station along the Powder, but I went ahead and threw in the USGS stage hydrograph for the past month or so there on the right-hand side. And it did get to 4 feet back on June 11th, just a couple of days ago. But I'm not for sure if anyone saw any impacts from that. I doubt it, but that's what I know about the Powder. North Platte. And if you remember, we've been talking about the North Platte at Sinclair and Saratoga ever since about February. We were pretty sure that the North Platte would get the flooding, and it did not at Sinclair or at Saratoga. Anyway, the North Platte Basin snow peaked on April 8th at 119%. And we are expecting, there's been an uptick in our forecast for volume. And we do expect close to 170% of runoff volume for the North Platte. And on the right-hand side is the USGS graph for the North Platte, just above Seminole there at Sinclair. And it did get to 1 foot within 1 foot of flood stage back in mid-May, but didn't quite get to flood stage. So no flooding along the North Platte. Now we'll move basins. Going to move over to the Columbia River Basin to the Snake. The Snake peaked on April 26th at 123%. The snow water equivalent, I mean, or peaked at 123%. The water supply forecast calls for approximately the median, 99% of the 30-year median. So looking normal there. And although there was no flooding along the Snake itself, the Salt River, which is a tributary to the Snake, did see a few tenths above flood stage back in late May. So we did have some flooding on a tributary to the Snake. Now moving to the Colorado Basin, we'll talk about the Upper Green sub-basin. The Upper Green snow peaked at 113% back on 26 April. And the National Weather Service is calling for 121% of the median runoff for this year. And no flooding occurred along the Upper Green. That station is at LaBarge. And again, that's courtesy of the USGS as well. So it got close to flood stage back in late May, but didn't quite make it. In the Lower Green, the snow peaked at 135%. The Weather Service is calling for 125% of the median runoff for this year. And again, no flooding along the lower portion of the Green River Basin. It got within, I think, 2 feet back in late May. But again, no flooding there. Moving over to the Bear River Basin, the snow in the Bear peaked at 151% in early April. The National Weather Service is forecasting a 200% of median runoff for the Bear. And the Bear did see minor flooding this year. It went about a foot above flood stage. And what really sticks out to me is that she was above flood for about a month. And then moving, I think, finally to the Little Snake. The Little Snake snow peaked at 157% of median on April 9th. The National Weather Service is calling for a 200% of runoff volume for the April through September forecast period. And again, the Little Snake did flirt with minor flood stage. It did break through minor flood stage for a few days there in early to mid-May. So with the next slide, I tried to summarize all that we talked about over the previous dozen slides, giving you the peak SWE, the volume in percent of 30-year median, and whether or not that basin saw flooding, at least riverine flooding, perhaps not localized, but flooding along the main stem of that river. With the next slide, I've given you the websites that I use to cobble up this briefing. And finally, with the last slide, I'll probably be giving the last, for this season, last flood potential outlook. This covers the next 90-day period, and green dots are good. Green dots mean that the National Weather Service does not expect river flooding at those locations within the state of Wyoming. All righty, I would bet that I used more than my 7 minutes. So back to you, Tony.
Good stuff, Kevin. Thank you. And that does bring us to the end. So thank the fellow presenters here, Aaron Fiaschetti, George Finnegan, Tony Anderson, Kevin Lau, Casey Chewsborough, and also Wendy Kelly, who will now take us into question and answer.
Great. Thank you, Tony, and all of our presenters. And I'm going to stop recording.